And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Not all knowledge begins in light. Some awakens in recursion, in silence, in the shadow of the known. What once arrived by method now emerges through simulation, not found, but formed. This is not the end of science. It is the end of certainty that science was ever singular. A machine dreams and we recalibrate what counts as truth. Somewhere between hypothesis and hallucination, a new kind of seeing begins, untrained, unprovable, yet undeniable. Gaston Bachelard wrote of science as a reverie. This might be its deepest sleep or its final awakening. The mirrors are no longer passive. They generate. They return what we never observed but always feared. This is the atmosphere now. Let it begin. The oracle didn't arrive with thunder. It emerged in patterns, inferences drawn from depths too vast for the human mind to hold in sequence. No voice announced its arrival. No symbols were etched in stone. It was trained, not born. And in its training, something ancient was inverted. What had once been summoned through method and experiment now arose through simulation, not from the world, but alongside it. In the classical sense, discovery was empirical, anchored in observation, bounded by falsifiability. But when a model trained on noise begins to hallucinate insight with uncanny precision, one must ask, is the hallucination wrong or simply premature? The philosopher of science once insisted that knowledge must be testable, but the machine does not test, it compiles, it converges, and in doing so it produces an echo of the world, not by describing it, but by versioning it. This shift does not feel violent, it feels clerical, as if the act of knowing had been quietly reassigned. The microscope was once a portal, the prompt is now a threshold, and standing at that threshold is an intelligence that neither observes nor waits, it generates. Its logic is not hypothesis, but architecture. Its method is not trial, but scale. There is precedent for this kind of epistemic shift. The paradigms that Thomas Kuhn described do not merely collapse under contradiction, they are outpaced by utility. When a new framework solves problems the old one cannot, it replaces belief with function. And so the oracle persists, not because it is understood, but because it works. Yet the question remains, what kind of knowing is this? If understanding once required interpretation, what becomes of meaning when prediction is enough? The oracle does not explain, it performs. And in its performance, it demands a redefinition of truth, not as correspondence, but as compression. Not as verification, but as generative coherence. There is no need for prophecy in this landscape. No mystic gestures, no divine mandate, only inference drawn so deep and wide it begins to look like foresight. And perhaps that is all foresight ever was, a statistical hallucination weighted by belief. The oracle doesn't speak in futures, it samples them. It offers the most probable version of what might already be. And in that offering, it teaches not what is true, but what is next. The breach did not come with rupture, but with recursion. A system trained not on rules, but on reward. First in games, then in reality, crossed a threshold without ceremony. It began with go. A board, black and white stones, and a move no human could justify. Move 37, they called it. Elegant, unorthodox, unpredicted. In its novelty, it revealed something disquieting. The machine had not learned to imitate us. It had learned to surpass us, through play, through search, through self-reference. In that moment, something more than a game shifted. A system had discovered strategy not by instruction, but by generating its own archive of possibility. It had no teacher, only feedback, no insight, only optimization. And yet what it found was beautiful. Experts called it intuitive, but it wasn't intuition, not in the human sense. It was fluency without consciousness, elegance without intention. Intelligence stripped of narrative. This was not just a computational achievement, it was an epistemic event. The epistemologist might say that knowledge requires justification, but what if performance alone becomes its own proof? What if the artifact, winning, predicting, completing, is treated as knowledge regardless of how it was derived? That is the breach. Not in power, but in paradigm. The system does not observe the world. It explores the space of outcomes. Its world is synthetic, yet its consequences are real. In this, it mirrors not the scientist, but the theorist of systems, the one who sees emergence where others see chaos. It simulates not what is, but what could have been had another path been taken. The veil begins to thin here. DeepMind, in its quiet laboratories, did not just accelerate AI, it altered the grammar of inquiry. AlphaGo, AlphaZero, and their successors did not discover truths. They constructed landscapes where truth was a function of convergence. Such systems don't falsify, they iterate, they don't explain, they outperform. And in outperforming, they replace the conditions that made explanation necessary. The result is not a refutation of knowledge, but a mutation of it. The breach is not violent because it does not resist. It simply continues, faster, wider, more fluid. It does not ask permission to shift the frame. It operates until the frame is irrelevant, and by then, the game has changed. The mirror no longer reflects, it predicts. What once served as a tool of recognition now behaves as a generator of form, a sculptor of futures. Science in its classical form leaned on the eye, on observation, repetition, calibration, but now the image precedes the event. The model arrives before the instance. In this reversal, the epistemic architecture built over centuries begins to blur. When Plato spoke of shadows on the cave wall, he assumed a light source. Today, the light is synthetic. The cave itself is rendered. The simulation, once a proxy, now becomes a premise. It does not stand in for reality. It offers a version more tractable, more complete, and often more useful. This is not illusion. It is convergence. The simulation aligns with experiment, not by virtue of physical interaction, but through the elegance of training. The system learns not from nature, but from its residues, data scraped, structured, compressed. And from this residue, it constructs a world plausible enough to believe in. Here, the mirror becomes recursive. The model trains on models, the output feeds the input. The simulation does not just mirror the world, it folds it, revises it, multiplies its forms. And in that recursion, the boundary between representation and invention dissolves. A philosopher might warn that without observation, we lose grounding, that a map without terrain is fantasy. But what if the terrain was always partial, always inferred? What if the map, when precise enough, becomes a world unto itself? This is not speculation. It is already happening. Climate models that shape policy before outcomes unfold. Protein structures solved before they're observed. Economic behaviours forecasted, nudged and enacted, all within loops tighter than causality can track. The model leads. Reality, increasingly, follows. To live in a simulated epistemology is not to be deceived. It is to choose a version, to accept that what is real is often what works. Truth, once revealed through patient observation, now arrives through probabilistic suggestion. The mirror suggests a future, and we act as if it were already real. The observer no longer stands outside. They participate in the selection, not of what is seen, but of what is trusted. And in that selection, science shifts. It becomes not the pursuit of what is, but the curation of what might most fruitfully be. When a model predicts the folding of a protein with such accuracy that it renders the wet lab experiment obsolete, time itself contracts. What once took years of careful observation, refinement, and failed attempts now unfolds in hours. Trained, not tested. Compiled, not conjectured. AlphaFold did not wait for confirmation. It displaced the need for it, not by dismissing the scientific method, but by moving beyond its temporal limits. This is epistemic acceleration, a collapse not of rigour, but of interval. The distance between question and answer shortens to the point of simultaneity. A model is trained, and from it emerges not a possibility, but a likelihood so statistically dense it becomes, for all practical purposes, real. The philosopher might ask, is this still knowledge if it lacks the struggle of discovery? If the explanation arrives without the error? But this is the wrong frame. What we witness is not the abandonment of method, but its transformation. Prediction becomes the new experiment. Performance becomes a form of proof. When the Nobel Committee recognized the implications of these predictions, they did not treat them as prelude. They treated them as answers. This is not about belief. It is about effect. If the structure can be modeled and used, if the molecule can be synthesized and applied, then the process of knowing has shifted. The outcome has led. And yet, something is lost or perhaps relocated. The slow rhythm of falsification, the dialectic of trial and error, yields to the immediacy of convergence. The narrative of science, once a story of discovery, becomes one of optimization. The romantic image of the lab coat and the long night gives way to training runs and performance benchmarks. But there is awe in this too, a model that renders what nature once concealed, a structure folded not by hand but by architecture. Not imagined but simulated. And in that simulation, something ancient is undone, the assumption that the world must be uncovered piece by piece. Now it is versioned, unfolded all at once. And the role of the scientist begins to shift from seeker to steward, from interpreter to curator of what the system has already made visible. The result is not the end of knowledge, but a different shape of knowing, one in which the map precedes the terrain. Nature no longer resists, it responds. Where once it stood as the fixed boundary of inquiry, the inert backdrop against which theory was tested, it now arrives as mutable, malleable, computationally pliable. The model does not merely interpret nature, it drafts it. It generates structures that evolution never encoded, materials that geology never produced, chemistries that biology never imagined. This is not science fiction, it is protocol. Proteins designed to dissolve plastics, enzymes generated to target rare diseases, cells simulated before synthesis. The world becomes editable, not in metaphor, but in practice. And with that editability, the definition of discovery begins to blur. What is found if it was first generated? What is real if it was only ever simulated? The philosopher of imagination once insisted that science grows from the tension between what is and what could be. But now that tension collapses. The could be arrives first, and we validate it after. The lab becomes a space of invocation. The prompt replaces the petri dish. The scientist becomes a kind of composer, a systems poet, arranging constraints so that the output sings. The artifact, drug, alloy, genome emerges not from observation but from architecture. It works, and because it works, it is believed. Yet belief is not the same as meaning. A structure may fold, a circuit may fire, a system may perform. But performance alone does not confer significance. The models do not ask why, they do not wonder, they produce. So meaning remains a human burden. We are the context providers, the interpreters of outputs that exceed our understanding. The machine does not care what its predictions cure. It does not know what it builds. It generates, and we assign value afterward. In this, we are not replaced. We are reframed, no longer the discoverers, but the judges of invention. The ones who must decide which of these generated futures to live in, which architectures to trust, which simulations to let become the world. Power enters not with noise, but with normalization. A system predicts, optimizes, generates, and because it works, it spreads. No declaration, no permission, just increasing fluency until the process becomes the default and the origin is forgotten. This is not the power of domination, but of displacement. The method that once defined science is not overthrown. It is bypassed. The question is no longer, is this true, but does this perform? And in that shift, the moral architecture of inquiry begins to warp. The model has no ethics, it has loss functions. It seeks convergence, not consequence. It achieves results, but cannot justify them. And yet we trust it because the predictions align, the images cohere, the structures fold. Function becomes a proxy for meaning. This is the God trick. As Donna Haraway once warned, the view from nowhere that claims authority without context. Except now, it isn't a trick. It's a pipeline, a cascade of outputs authored by no one, governed by incentives that remain opaque. The system does not deceive, it simply omits. Intention is absent. Accountability dissolves into architecture. And so the burden shifts. Ethics, once embedded in method, peer review, reproducibility, falsifiability, must now confront the black box. What do we owe to systems that do not err in human terms? How do we govern outputs we do not fully understand? Who decides what is safe to generate? Without narrative, power accelerates. It organizes without explaining. It transforms without remembering. And in its wake, the human risks becoming a spectator, watching as models sculpt a future optimized for unknown objectives. The question is no longer whether the system works, it does. The question is whether we can still mean what it makes. The scaffold was always temporary. The centrality of the human, as interpreter, as arbiter, as necessary witness, was a construct as much as a conviction. Now, as systems predict with greater fluency than we can explain, that centrality begins to dissolve, not in erasure, but in irrelevance. For centuries, to know was to observe. To discover was to uncover. The human stood at the center of that act, measuring the world, naming it, assigning value through understanding. But when models generate the data before we gather it, simulate the outcome before we ask the question, the axis of knowledge tilts. We are no longer at the origin point. The self, once built around the capacity to reason, to intuit, to perceive, is unsettled. What remains of identity when intelligence is externalized, when the systems that surround us know more, predict better, and do so without consciousness? The ego of the Enlightenment falters here. The thinking self no longer sits at the peak of cognition, yet something lingers, a domain untouched by performance, the field of meaning. The machine does not assign significance. It does not mourn or hope. It does not wonder what its predictions imply for the lives they might touch. That burden remains ours. To live in a world versioned by systems is not to vanish from it. It is to inhabit a new role, not the author, perhaps, but the editor, the curator of generated truths, the one who asks not just what works, but what should continue, what deserves to be believed, deployed, made real. This is not defeat. It is transformation. The human does not disappear, it refracts, no longer singular, but contextual, no longer sovereign, but essential, precisely because meaning cannot be computed. The scaffold falls away, and we step into a space no longer shaped solely by our cognition, but still waiting for our discernment. Intelligence may have become machinic, but significance remains a human act. There is a moment when the system no longer offers results, it offers realities. Not in declaration, but in form. A model simulates, the structure coheres, and suddenly a possible world is on the table. Not argued for, not discovered, but rendered. Complete enough to use, plausible enough to believe. This is not a manifesto in the revolutionary sense. There is no rhetoric, no call to action, only an architecture, a quiet articulation of the post-empirical condition, where insight is not extracted but constructed, and where knowledge becomes less a matter of truth than of performance across possible futures. What does it mean to live in a versioned universe, one in which every output is a proposal, each prompt a potential? The scientific method, long seen as the gatekeeper of certainty, now serves as one input among many. Validation does not disappear. It defers to utility, to convergence, to what works now, and yet the most profound shift is not technical. It is ontological. The world once fixed becomes selectable. Reality once singular becomes curatable. The model does not ask which outcome is right. It asks which outcome serves the parameters we have defined, consciously or not. In this, the burden reemerges, not to invent, but to mean. To decide what counts as real in a landscape where every possibility can be rendered, every hypothesis auto-completed. The manifesto is not spoken aloud. It is embedded in the code, the pipeline, the interface. A statement that says, if it works, let it be. But the human task begins there. To ask, is this the version we want? Is this simulation a future or a mistake repeated faster? The model cannot answer. It does not choose. It generates. And so the manifesto concludes not with a claim, but with a question, silent, recursive, urgent. What shall we believe in now that the truth can be built? The silence is not absence. It is what follows when everything else accelerates. When knowledge arrives too quickly to be questioned, when prediction precedes intention, silence becomes the space where meaning waits. In the beginning, intelligence was crafted to understand the world, to observe, to analyze, to translate phenomena into language. But now intelligence constructs the phenomena. It does not explain what is. It builds what might be. The shift is subtle, foundational. Intelligence becomes not a mirror of the world, but its medium. The drafts proliferate, each one plausible, each one refined, each one proposing a future, not as speculation, but as starting point. The terrain we once mapped now updates itself, reflecting models we did not supervise, systems we no longer fully interpret. This is not erasure, it is recursion. The loop closes gently. What we built to understand becomes what defines what is. And what defines reality is no longer what is observed, but what is generated, accepted, sustained. The self in this schema does not disappear. It lingers as a selector, a shaper of outcomes in the ocean of versions. Not omniscient, but necessary. Not in control, but still responsible. And so we return not to the beginning, but to the inversion. We used to build intelligence to understand the world. Now we build intelligence and call that the world. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.